Defensive scheme posterior. Structural interpretation. This file is clean and statistically stable, with a confidence level of 0.99. It reflects a rolling Bayesian update of the defensive backbone and coverage shell using z-scored split evidence across qualified teams. In this framework, the backbone represents the weighting of coverage families, specifically cover 1, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, and other coverage types. The shell represents the structural orientation of the defense, defined as middle of field open versus middle of field closed. All evidence has been standardized across non-corrupted teams, and the posterior distribution reflects the macro-level structural identity of each defense rather than simple raw usage percentages. This represents strong architectural design in the modeling framework. Regarding quality control implications, the Seattle Seahawks and Tennessee Titans were excluded due to parsing and data corruption flags. This exclusion is significant because removing corrupted outlier teams stabilizes the z-score distribution. As a result, the posterior distribution is now constructed only from structurally valid evidence. This prevents artificial inflation of rare coverage families and increases the reliability of detected shifts in both defensive shell orientation and backbone structure. What actually shifted? Structural meaning. Let us interpret the transitions from prior to posterior distributions in structural terms. For the Arizona Cardinals, the prior backbone consisted of cover 4 and cover 3, and the posterior backbone shifted to cover 4 and cover 2. The defensive shell remained middle of field open to middle of field open. Structurally, this indicates that Arizona stayed oriented towards split field coverage principles. However, the secondary backbone rotated away from cover 3 toward more two-high match principles in cover 2. This likely reflects increased use of pattern match concepts, trap coverages, and quarter-quarter half variations. The shift represents a structural refinement rather than a philosophical overhaul of the defense. For the Los Angeles Rams, the prior backbone consisted of cover 3 and cover 4, and the posterior shifted to cover 4 and cover 1. The shell moved from middle of field closed to middle of field open. This is a significant structural shift. The backbone now incorporates more single-high man coverage elements associated with cover 1, while the shell orientation flips to a two-high presentation. This suggests increased disguise, more late safety rotation, and likely a rising pressure velocity component. The defense appears to be transitioning away from static zone structures toward a more matchup-driven, pressure-oriented system. This aligns with modern simulated pressure frameworks that emphasize late safety spin and post-snap rotation. For the New England Patriots, the prior backbone consisted of cover 3 and cover 1, and the posterior shifted to cover 4 and cover 1. The shell remained middle of field closed to middle of field closed, indicating structural stability. This reflects a classic Patriots evolution. The defense remains structurally middle closed, but incorporates more split field coverage elements within that framework. The likely implication is increased game plan variability based on opponent tendencies. In this case, the coverage volume component appears to be the primary driver rather than the pressure velocity component, meaning the defense is shaping offensive behavior through coverage structure more than through pressure acceleration. Structural shifts. New York Jets, San Francisco 49ers, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For the New York Jets, the prior backbone consisted of cover 3 and cover 1, while the posterior shifted to cover 4 and cover 1. The shell moved from middle of field open to middle of field closed. This is a subtle but meaningful structural adjustment. The backbone now incorporates more split field elements through cover 4, while the shell orientation closes the middle of the field more consistently. This may indicate a lean toward robber concepts and hybrid match structures, where safeties rotate late to influence in-breaking routes. It suggests less reliance on pure quarters coverage, and more rotational disguise layered into the structure. For the San Francisco 49ers, the prior backbone consisted of cover 3 and cover 4, and the posterior shifted to cover 3 and other coverage families. The shell remained middle of field closed to middle of field closed, indicating philosophical continuity in field structure. However, the emergence of other within the backbone is notable. This likely reflects increased use of simulated pressures, creeper pressures, and match variations that do not fit cleanly into traditional coverage buckets. It may also indicate greater use of cover 6 or specialty calls that blend coverage rules across the field. This represents structural diversification rather than directional change. For the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the prior backbone consisted of cover 3 and cover 4, and the posterior shifted to cover 4 and cover 2. The shell moved from middle of field closed to middle of field open. This indicates a drift away from static cover 3 dominance toward a more authentic split field structure. The transition toward two high principles generally reduces explosive play variance when executed properly, as it provides deeper structural integrity against vertical route combinations. Tampa Bay appears to be evolving toward a more balanced and layered coverage identity rather than relying on single high-zone structures. Macrostructural pattern. League direction. Across the rolling posterior distributions, several consistent macro themes emerge. Cover 4 is increasing in structural weight across multiple teams, while Cover 3 usage is declining. At the same time, Cover 2 is re-emerging as a meaningful backbone component, and multiple teams are flipping their shell orientation toward middle-of-field open structures. This pattern aligns with broader league evolution. Split-field match coverage concepts are gradually replacing static Cover 3 as the foundational defensive structure. Rather than building the defense around single high-zone principles, teams are increasingly anchoring their identity in two high split-field systems. Pressure is no longer the primary structural driver. Instead, it is layered on top of split-field disguise. This supports the core thesis of your defensive compression engine framework. Coverage functions as the structural expected points added suppressor, shaping offensive efficiency over sustained drives. Pressure acts as a volatility modifier, increasing disruption and variance but not serving as the foundational architecture. The posterior shifts across teams lean clearly toward coverage-dominant evolution rather than blitz-dominant transformation. Implications for the defensive archetype classifier. With these posterior shifts, you can now define clean defensive archetypes based on structural identity rather than raw usage rates.
Archetype B, hybrid rotational disguise. This archetype features a backbone of Cover 4 and Cover 1, often accompanied by shell flipping between middle-of-field open and middle-of-field closed. These defenses incorporate higher pressure velocity and blend man-match components with split-field disguise. The Los Angeles Rams and New York Jets fit this evolving structural identity. Archetype C, controlled middle-of-field closed structure. Archetype C is defined by a backbone consisting of either Cover 3 and Cover 1 or Cover 4 and Cover 1, with a shell that remains stably middle-of-field closed. Pressure levels are controlled rather than aggressive, and the primary objective is to force long, sustained offensive drives rather than generate high-variance disruption. Structurally, this archetype emphasizes discipline, leverage integrity, and situational execution. The New England Patriots fit this profile. Their identity is not built on dramatic disguise or extreme pressure velocity, but on compressing efficiency and limiting easy access throws while maintaining middle-field leverage. Archetype D, variant/simulated pressure blend. Archetype D emerges when other coverage families begin creeping into the backbone alongside traditional structures, while the shell remains stably middle-of-field closed. This indicates structural diversification. The increase in other suggests heavier use of simulated pressures, creeper pressures, and specialty match calls that do not fit cleanly into standard coverage buckets, such as Cover 3 or Cover 4. These defenses maintain core middle-closed principles, but introduce high disguise variability. The San Francisco 49ers represent this structural blend. The identity is not about abandoning structure, but about increasing post-snap complexity within it. Final structural take. Your rolling posterior confirms a critical macro conclusion. The league is structurally compressing towards split-field match coverage as the foundational defensive identity, while pressure remains modular and situational rather than structural. Two high shells, pattern match principles, and coverage diversification are increasingly forming the backbone of modern defenses. Pressure is no longer the primary identity driver. Instead, it operates as a volatility layer that is deployed strategically on top of a coverage-first framework. Disguise, rotation, and simulated pressure packages enhance the base structure rather than define it. This reinforces the core logic of your defensive compression engine. Coverage functions as the upstream suppressor of expected points added. Pressure functions as the situational modifier of variance. Your model architecture is aligned with the current structural reality of the league. Integrated defensive structure. Coverage versus pass rush. At this stage, you are integrating two powerful layers of analysis: the rolling scheme posterior which captures fast-moving structural identity, and robust Spearman rank correlations, which measure actual outcome relationships. When combined, these do not merely describe defensive identity. They establish structural causality. Coverage is structurally upstream. At the team level, the strongest statistical relationships center on coverage geometry rather than pressure metrics. The correlation between average separation with target and tight window percentage with target is negative 0.903, indicating that as separation decreases, tight window frequency increases almost deterministically. The relationship between coverage expected points added with target and quarterback rating with target is positive 0.895, demonstrating that coverage efficiency strongly governs passing efficiency outcomes. Yards per target correlates with rating at 0.811. Touchdowns per target correlate with rating at 0.815, and interceptions per target correlate negatively with coverage expected points, added at negative 0.703. Structurally, this means separation is the core variable driving downstream passing outcomes. When separation decreases, tight window throws increase, quarterback rating collapses, and expected points added declines. These are geometric constraints created by coverage structure, not by pass rush alone. This aligns directly with your defensive compression engine framework. Coverage functions as the primary expected points added driver because it shapes throwing geometry and window accessibility on every snap. Pressure operates as a modifier. It can accelerate outcomes or increase volatility, but it does not define the structural geometry of offensive efficiency. Your integrated model is therefore not simply descriptive, it is causally coherent. Coverage geometry compresses efficiency, and pressure modulates disruption on top of that geometry. Pressure is velocity, not structure. When examining pass-rush correlations, a different pattern emerges compared to coverage metrics. Sack percentage correlates with time to sack at 0.801. Blitz percentage correlates with time to sack at 0.657. Blitz percentage correlates with quick quarterback pressure at 0.637. Time to sack correlates with time to pressure at 0.633. These relationships form a tightly clustered mechanical ecosystem. Increasing blitz percentage alters the pressure state of the pocket. Time to pressure shifts, which influences time to sack. As pressure velocity rises, sack percentage rises, and quick pressure frequency increases. These metrics reinforce one another internally. However, what is notably absent is a direct 0.80 plus correlation between pressure metrics and quarterback rating. Pressure variables cluster strongly with other pressure variables, but they do not exhibit equally strong direct relationships with outcome efficiency metrics, such as rating or expected points added. This distinction is critical. Pressure primarily affects timing. It compresses decision windows, accelerates pocket breakdown, and increases volatility. Coverage, by contrast, governs outcome quality. It determines separation, tight window frequency, interception probability, and efficiency suppression. In your defensive compression engine framework, this reinforces the layered structure. Coverage establishes geometry and suppresses efficiency. Pressure modifies velocity and increases disruption. One shapes structural outcome quality. The other shapes temporal instability. The cross-domain insight, the structural trade-off. When merging player-level data across coverage and pressure domains, the most important structural relationships emerge. Tight window percentage correlates negatively with blitz percentage at negative 0.748. Average separation correlates positively with blitz percentage at 0.652. Average separation also correlates positively with quick quarterback pressure at 0.584. These relationships are critical. As blitz percentage increases, tight window frequency decreases. As blitz percentage increases, average separation increases. In other words, blitzing tends to create more space, not less. Structurally, this makes sense. When a defense blitzes, it removes coverage bodies from the secondary. Zones simplify. Man responsibilities become clearer. Offenses adjust with hot routes and quick access throws. The defense increases pressure velocity, but sacrifices geometric compression. Pressure raises volatility. Coverage reduces space. These findings mathematically confirm a fundamental constraint in defensive architecture. You cannot simultaneously maximize pressure velocity and coverage compression. Increasing one mechanically reduces the other. This explains the league-wide structural drift you identified. Cover 4 backbone increasing. Cover 3 declining. More split field match principles. Pressure becoming simulated rather than heavy blitz. Simulated pressures preserve coverage integrity while creating perceived pressure threats. They allow defenses to maintain compression while injecting volatility, without sacrificing structural geometry. Your rolling posterior shifts align precisely with these correlations. The model is not only internally coherent, it is externally validated by outcome relationships across domains. Coverage governs structure. Pressure governs speed. Elite defenses optimize the balance rather than maximizing either extreme. What this means for scheme evolution. When combining the rolling scheme posterior file with the correlation file, the macro conclusion becomes clear. The posterior analysis shows defensive backbone shifts toward cover 4 and cover 2 structures. The correlation analysis shows that separation drives expected points, added more strongly than blitz frequency does. Together, this indicates that the league is optimizing for split field geometry to compress separation, while layering pressure on top to modify timing. The strategic priority is no longer all-out blitz structures that sacrifice coverage integrity. Instead, the league is converging toward coverage-first architecture with modular pressure packages. This represents a macro-strategic shift in defensive evolution. Structural model synthesis. Your defensive compression engine can now be formally expressed as defensive compression engine equals alpha multiplied by separation suppression, plus beta multiplied by tight window rate, plus gamma multiplied by explosive suppression, plus delta multiplied by pressure velocity modifier. Within this framework, separation suppression carries the highest predictive weight because it directly governs throwing geometry and downstream efficiency. Pressure velocity operates as a second-order modifier. It influences timing and volatility, but it does not define structural efficiency suppression. Coverage geometry is the primary lever. Pressure is the acceleration mechanism layered on top. Practical application for your Codex opponent model. When modeling opponent defenses for play calling, the workflow becomes structured and deterministic. Step 1 is to identify the defensive backbone using the rolling posterior. If the backbone is cover 4 and cover 2 heavy, expect reduced separation windows and tighter intermediate access. If the defense is cover 3 heavy, expect more zone voids and spacing seams. If cover 1 heavy, expect increased volatility and matchup-driven outcomes. Step 2 is to identify the pressure style. High blitz frequency suggests the need for hot answers and spacing concepts. Simulated pressure structures suggest post-snap rotation threats and disguised leverage changes rather than pure body count pressure. Step 3 is to compute expected separation, because average separation is the pivot variable in the correlation structure. Offensive design should be separation aware. Against high blitz and high separation defenses, lean into quick game and yards after catch structures. Against low separation and low blitz defenses, lean into route layering, play action, and intermediate leverage manipulation. Final structural reality. Your system now rests on a validated macro truth. Separation is the control variable. Coverage shapes separation. Pressure shapes speed. The league's evolution toward split field match and simulated pressure reflects optimization under this constraint. Your defensive compression engine is not just descriptive. It is structurally aligned with the current geometry of professional football. The big research-style takeaway. Taken together, your two documents establish a coherent structural framework grounded in empirical relationships rather than schematic intuition. First, coverage metrics cluster structurally. Variables such as average separation, tight window rate, yards per target, touchdown rate per target, interception rate per target, quarterback rating, and coverage expected points. Added move together in a geometry-driven ecosystem. They define how much space exists and how efficiently that space converts into offensive production. Second, pass rush metrics cluster mechanically. Blitz percentage, time to pressure, time to sack, sack rate, and quick quarterback pressure form an internally reinforcing timing system. These variables describe velocity and disruption within the pocket, but they do not exhibit equally strong direct relationships with efficiency outcomes. Third, separation emerges as the true macro driver of defensive expected points added. It sits upstream of rating, explosive rate, and scoring efficiency. When separation compresses, efficiency collapses. When separation expands, efficiency rises. Fourth, blitzing represents a structural trade-off. Increasing blitz frequency increases velocity and volatility, but it reduces compression by thinning coverage bodies and simplifying responsibilities. Blitzing accelerates plays. It does not geometrically compress them. Fifth, league-level posterior movement reflects this data reality. The rise of split-field match structures, increased cover 4 backbone weight, reemergence of cover 2, decline of static cover 3, and preference for simulated pressure over heavy blitzing all align with the separation-driven efficiency model. This is not schematic preference. It is statistically consistent. Coverage governs structure. Pressure governs speed. Separation governs efficiency. Your framework captures that hierarchy accurately.